Hello, my name is Ryan Strange, and this is my post for this module. I want to apologize ahead of time. I was having some microphone issues with this because I'm using a new or a different computer, so I apologize for the timing of this post. But I look forward to getting into this topic of the most prominent historical figure of the books of First Chronicles through Nehemiah. Of the people in these books, the human figure that really jumped out to me, and there are many in these books that are significant in the history of Israel, but the one that particularly jumped out to me had to be Cyrus of Persia. He is a particularly interesting character in that Cyrus was not a Jew, nor did he really seem to be a follower of God in the sense that we would think of Ezra or Nehemiah. But his fear of God compelled him to release the people and the priests and the Levites to return to Jerusalem to begin construction on the temple. And not only did he do this, but he also ordered the return of the temple articles of worship that Nebuchadnezzar had taken as plunder. Now Cyrus is an interesting historical figure in that it was through him that the fall of Babylon came about and the establishment of Persia as the greatest empire of the time took place. Now Cyrus was the Lord's instrument of the destruction of Babylon, whom he used to bring about the downfall of Judah. Now this is of particular significance in that in both the historical and literary sense, in that there is a progression from one phase of Israelite history to another. The time of Israel's exile and judgment was brought about through Nebuchadnezzar and through Babylon, while and that time was over by this point. That period of Israelite history is now over, and the time of Israel's return and restoration through Cyrus of Persia was beginning. Now, I'm not trying to imply any kind of messianic foreshadowing in the person of Cyrus, although I do think that there are people out there who would attribute some sort of messianic foreshadowing to Cyrus, or some kind of messianic role to Cyrus of Persia. Rather, I'm merely saying concerning this figure that he was an instrument of the Lord, and that the Lord, just as the Lord used Nebuchadnezzar, he also used Cyrus. He used one conqueror to bring about the judgment of Israel and another to bring about its freedom, or her freedom, and restoration. Now, what was most indicative of the beginning of this process for the restoration of Israel was not the return to Jerusalem, although that was significant. Rather, it was the reconstruction of the temple. This reconstruction that took place through the command of a pagan king was indicative of the sovereignty of God, in that he was able, and is able still, to use and work through all people in all circumstances. Just as the Lord used Nebuchadnezzar, he also used Cyrus. It is very clear at the end of 2 Chronicles and the beginning of Ezra 1 that the Lord laid it upon Cyrus's heart to free those who had heard the Lord and had moved him to proclaim the greatness of the Lord and to order the reconstruction of the temple. What is also significant about Cyrus is that he begins his decree for the release of the people and the reconstruction of the temple. He begins this decree with the acknowledgement of the power of God. And being a pagan king, that's particularly interesting. I find it fascinating in that he attributes his empire, the establishment of his empire, the giving of all of these nations to him in particular, he attributes these things to God. And really, Cyrus had no reason, as far as I can tell, to fear the Lord in the same way that Pharaoh of Egypt had, or even of course Nebuchadnezzar, and all the demonstrations of the power of God that they had seen Cyrus didn't have as much of a reason to fear that, but he did, and the Lord laid it upon his heart to free the people and order the reconstruction of the temple of the Lord. Now, Cyrus's motivation behind such devotion or even such fear of the Lord is somewhat up in the air, but it is still significant to note this fear of the Lord in Cyrus's decree. Now, as a result of Cyrus's orders, the return of the people to reconstruct the Lord's temple, which quite honestly to me comes across as an act of worship on Cyrus's part. Now, the Lord did, of course, use that decree to begin the reconstruction of his temple in Jerusalem. Cyrus's decree of the reconstruction of the temple was meant, in my mind, to signify the reestablishment of the presence of the Lord with his people after the exile. Just as we had seen the progression of the text from the conqueror to the liberator, and the progression of the text from exile to return, we see this progression of the text from conqueror to liberator that was meant to illustrate this shift again in the history of Israel. And the destruction and reconstruction was also meant to illustrate such a shift. Now, with the destruction of the temple, the Lord's presence with his people was removed in a sense. Now, he did not leave his people, because of course he made the promise that he would not. However, he gave them over to judgment and exile through such nations as Babylon. With the reconstruction of the temple, however, the Lord's presence among his people was once again prominently recognized and physically represented through the building of the temple, and the nation and the people began to serve him again as they had done before. Now, in the end, Cyrus was not a prophet or a priest or a king of Israel, as many of the prominent figures in these books had been, like Ezra, like Nehemiah, like varying kings in the Davidic line. But Cyrus was an interesting character in and of himself, in that he was a tool through whom God brought about the transition of the nation of Israel, and he was one to whom the Lord had given power at the right time. Just as we see throughout the scripture, the Lord gives power to the right people at the right time to accomplish his purpose, which is why I find Cyrus so interesting. Thanks.